Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., a man woke up to the sound of a woman whispering for help through the wall of his apartment. The apartment next door had been sealed for 12 years, since the night a woman was murdered inside. On a quiet residential block in a mid-sized American city, an apartment building sat in the kind of neglect that rarely attracts attention. Peeling paint, outdated wiring, and a property manager more concerned with collecting rent than maintaining the structure made the building inexpensive and easy to move into. For most tenants, it was temporary housing, a way station between lives. For one particular resident, however, the building would become the center of an investigation that raised disturbing questions about the fragile boundary between perception, memory, and the physical manifestation of guilt. The man moved in during early autumn. He was in his mid-30s, recently unemployed, and searching for somewhere affordable while rebuilding his life. According to rental records, the apartment he chose, Unit 4B, had been vacant for several months. The neighboring Unit 4C, however, had been empty for much longer. 12 years earlier, Unit 4C had been the site of a violent homicide. A young woman named Elena Vance had been killed inside. The case had drawn brief media attention at the time, but public interest faded once the primary suspect, a local drifter, was cleared and the trail went cold. The apartment was sealed by the owner, partially out of legal entanglement and partially out of a superstitious dread that no tenant would ever stay. The new resident, Elias Thorne, claimed he did not know about the building's history when he signed the lease. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, drawn to the low rent and the anonymity of the decaying hallways. For the first few nights, nothing unusual occurred. Elias unpacked his belongings, adjusted to the thin walls and distant traffic noise, and began establishing a routine. But the silence of the building began to weigh on him. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. Then, several days after moving in, the atmosphere shifted. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, Elias woke suddenly. The air in his bedroom felt heavy, pressurized. From the other side of the wall shared with the sealed Unit 4C, came a sound. According to his initial statement to the police, the voice was faint but unmistakably human. It was a woman's whisper, thin and ragged, like air passing through a damaged throat. The message was a simple, repetitive plea for help. Elias initially contacted the building manager, suggesting that a squatter might have broken into the sealed unit. The manager, a cynical man named Miller, scoffed at the idea. He showed Elias the door to 4C. It was reinforced with a heavy deadbolt and a steel crossbar. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. Unless your ghost can breathe through bricks, Miller told him. You're hearing the pipes. But the pattern continued with a mechanical, haunting precision. Every night, at precisely 3:17 a.m., the whisper returned. Eventually, Elias called the local precinct. His distress was so palpable that 2 officers were dispatched for a welfare check. They found Elias sitting in his dark living room, staring at the wall. When they inspected the hallway, they confirmed the manager's report. The unit was a tomb. No one had entered or exited in years. Detectives took over the case when Elias mentioned the 3:17 detail. In the original 12-year-old case file, the estimated time of Elena Vance's death was between 3 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. The precision of Elias's claim suggested something beyond a simple auditory hallucination. It suggested a specific, localized memory. The first formal interview took place at the station. Detective Sarah Vance, no relation to the victim, led the questioning. From a behavioral analysis perspective, Elias was a fascinating subject. He was calm, almost clinical, in his descriptions of the voice. He spoke about the emotional texture of the whisper, describing it as terrified and struggling to form consonants. However, Detective Vance noticed a subtle shift when the conversation moved from the noise to the building's history. "Why that building, Elias?" she asked. "Out of all the cheap housing in this city, why the one place where a woman was murdered a decade ago?" Elias's gaze, previously steady, drifted downward to the corner of the metal table. "It was just a listing," he said. His voice dropped an octave and his speech slowed, a classic sign of cognitive load. He was no longer retrieving a memory, he was constructing a narrative. Then came the slip. The voice, Elias said, leaning forward. She doesn't sound like she's haunting me. She sounds like she's still waiting for the ambulance. She sounds like she did before the room went quiet. Detective Vance caught the shift in tense and the specific detail. She? You've decided it's a woman? Elias blinked, his throat working as he swallowed. The whispers, they're high-pitched, it's obvious. And you mentioned an ambulance, Vance continued, her voice soft but sharp. The original report from 12 years ago was never fully released to the public. The fact that the victim survived for several minutes and tried to call out was a detail held back by the coroner. The room went silent. This was controlled silence, a tactic designed to let the suspect's own anxiety fill the void. Elias began to fidget. He tapped a rhythmic beat on his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I read it online, Elias finally stammered. In the forums, true crime fans discussed these things. The detectives didn't buy it. They had already run a deep dive into Elias Thorne's history. Property records from 12 years ago placed Elias not just in the city, but in a basement apartment 3 doors down from the victim. More importantly, digital forensics recovered a deleted social media account from that era. Elias had been a regular at the coffee shop where Elena Vance worked. He had followed her digital footprint with an intensity that bordered on obsession, though he had never been flagged as a suspect at the time. The turning point of the interview was a strategic bluff. Elias, Detective Vance said, sliding a digital recorder across the table. We installed a high-sensitivity acoustic monitor in 4C this morning with the owner's permission. We heard the 3:17 a.m. event. Elias went pale. What did it say? It didn't say anything, Vance lied, because there was no sound. The room was silent. But the monitor did pick up something else. It picked up the sound of someone crying through the wall in your apartment. It picked up you, Elias whispering back. The facade shattered. Elias didn't confess to the murder immediately, but his narrative flipped. He stopped claiming the voice was real and began suggesting he was remembering it too loudly. In forensic psychology, this is known as the return of the repressed. Elias hadn't moved back to the building by accident. He had been drawn back by a compulsion to repeat. He had spent 12 years trying to bury the memory of that night, but the mind is not a grave. It is a garden. What you bury grows. The voice wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was Elias's own internal monologue, fractured by guilt and projected onto the physical space where his life had diverged into darkness. He was hearing the echoes of his own crime, played back by a brain that could no longer carry the weight of the secret. The investigation eventually found a trophy Elias had kept, a small silver keychain belonging to Elena, tucked inside the insulation of his new apartment's wall. He had brought the evidence back to the scene of the crime, needing to be near the only thing that made him feel real. The human mind has a remarkable ability to conceal the truth from the world. But as Elias Thorne learned in the cold light of the interrogation room, the mind is far less successful at concealing the truth from itself. In the quiet hours of the morning, when the rest of the city sleeps, the conscious eventually finds its voice, and it always speaks at 3:17 a.m.